Welcome back to another episode of Written for Our Admonition. We're beginning the month of February with a conversation about the other patriarchs that come after Abraham. We're speaking specifically about his descendants, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Now, as the episode title might indicate to you, this is going to be a bit of a speed run concerning this particular matter, only because we want to spend time more with God's promises that were given to all of these men rather than all the specific events that unfolded in the book of Genesis. That's not to say that the events that take place from Genesis chapters 25 to the end of the book are unimportant. It's just to say that for our purposes and what we're trying to focus on in summary fashion is we really want to see what God's promises have been, how he's able to work through these people despite their flaws, and ultimately what the outcome is more so than what took place to get us to that point. So our focus will really be on that, even though we are covering a lot of ground. I would definitely encourage you to take the time to read Genesis chapters 25 through 50. If you haven't already done the first 25 chapters, I would encourage you to read through that as well. But especially chapters 25 through 50, because it really does fill a lot of the details in that will be important later. We'll likely look back at some of those as we go through the series just to make sure we understand what's taking place and why certain references are made. But at least for our purposes right here, right now, we just want to focus on Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph and how God is going to use them to carry out his promises. So, we pick up where we left off in our previous conversation about Abraham, and we remember that he was a faithful man. That is his legacy. And we remember how much God blessed him because of his faithfulness. Over and over again, we saw with Abraham how much God had done for him and how many promises he made. We saw that God established his covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 17. We see that he blessed him with a son named Isaac, who is also referred to as the son of promise, and Abraham proved faithful with that son as well. And so we're going to find that while the descendants of Abraham do not measure up to Abraham himself per se, they are still going to be blessed by the Lord regardless. Because again, the plan that God set in motion that we saw all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, and even before that if you want to argue that a little bit further, but especially starting in Genesis 12 and moving forward from there, is that God has a plan in mind that he wants to bring to pass. And we'll see what that plan is as we go throughout the remainder of the Old Testament here. But most certainly that is what is in view when we talk about the descendants of Abraham, is how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham? How will he bring to pass that promise in Genesis 12 that all the families of the earth would be blessed through Abraham? What will that look like? That's the question we want to focus on as we go through, is how this is going to unfold. And we see that as we talk about Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, more and more information is given to us about what God actually intends to bring to pass. Now, we're looking at it from our perspective now, and hindsight is always 20/20, as we well know. So we understand that there are limitations in their knowledge that they would have had at that time. So they're living in a moment where they didn't necessarily know from day to day or year to year what God was doing through them. They just knew that he had a plan, he had a promise, and they wanted to trust in that. So even if they don't measure up to Abraham, we still see that they most certainly were faithful in as much as they were able to be in their time. And so we also notice this, as we have noted here on the slide and the last little bullet point we have there, is that what happens with the descendants of Abraham, with Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, is often unexpected. The way that God carries out his promises really is a bit strange at times from our human perspective. But again, the results will speak for themselves, and we'll see how his wisdom really shines through in how he carries out these promises and brings them to pass in ways that no one could possibly predict. And once again, it just goes to show how God is able to initiate reversals, to take one situation that looks like it's going clearly in one direction and make it go in a completely different one because of his graciousness and his great power. So having discussed that about Abraham and his connection to Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, let's talk about Isaac for just a moment. So we already understand from our previous conversation that Isaac is the son of promise. He is the one that the Lord directly said would be the carrier of that promise, that through Isaac, Abraham's seed would be called. And we also notice that Isaac really was set up for success by Abraham. And this is something that is very positive in Abraham's favor and for Isaac for that matter. It says in Genesis chapter 25 and verse 5 that prior to Abraham's departure from this life, that he gave everything that he had to his son Isaac. He gave a little bit to Ishmael, at least a little bit earlier on, but at the end of his life, he gave whatever was left to Isaac. He definitely blessed him more than he blessed Ishmael and the other descendants that he had, because remember, Abraham had more than just those two sons. He had several according to Genesis 25, but he definitely gave more to Isaac, reflecting once again his status as the son of promise. And then we notice this about Isaac, just like we saw with Abraham. There's multiple references about Isaac where the Lord was with him and the Lord blessed him. You find that in Genesis chapter 25 and verse 11 as a generic reference to that. And verse 21 is a bit more specific there, where the Lord blesses Isaac and his wife Rebekah with children. So Isaac was distressed about the fact that his wife was barren. He prayed to the Lord concerning this, and he opened her womb to allow them to have twins, who we will come to know as Jacob and Esau. But focusing specifically on the promise that God had in mind here for Isaac, as he did for Abraham, let's go to Genesis chapter 26 and understand how God is going to continue his promise through Isaac and what that will look like. So we're going to look here at Genesis chapter 26 and verses 1 through 5. And let's go ahead and read this together from the text in Genesis. There was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So we see once again the same basic idea that was presented to Abraham, presented now to Isaac. So this is an important consideration, because this is not the last time we're going to see this. This is just one of many where this occurs in the book of Genesis. There's an emphasis on this promise that God has. What he issued to Abraham is now issued to Isaac. It'll be later issued to Jacob. It'll later be issued to others. So we have this promise having a continuation. This is the Lord reminding the descendants of Abraham that he has not forgotten them, that he is not just going to let this promise die in the air. He has every intention to bring this to pass, and he wants them to understand he still has a purpose for them, and he still has something that he is working out to their benefit to bring about his will. So we notice specifically here in verse 3 and in verse 4 that the promise is going to involve this. It is going to involve land, according to verse 3. The oath that God swore to Abraham referred to that back in Genesis chapter 15, as well as Genesis chapter 22. And then in verse 4, I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. So there is a promise given there that the descendants of Isaac, much like it was said about the descendants of Abraham, are going to be multiplied as the stars of heaven, illustrating to us through that word picture that the descendants of these people are going to be so numerous, you may as well not even try to count them. Not to say that they couldn't be counted, but just to say that it will be more numerous than anyone could possibly expect. And we're going to see in this particular discussion a little bit later just how incredible this really is. So God promises, I will give you a land. There is a land involved in this promise. There's also multiplication of descendants involved in this promise. And that was said to Abraham, and now it is said here to Isaac, the son of Abraham, as well. So with that in mind, as Isaac continues his life with the Lord's blessing, he's fully aware that God intends to use him and his descendants to carry out the promise that God made to Abraham, and that same knowledge will be imparted later on into Isaac's son, Jacob. But that does bring us to that point. We do want to understand something about Isaac. So we talk about Isaac, and we understand, once again, he's the son of promise, and there's not a lot of information given about his character. But one thing we do note is that he had a similar flaw to Abraham in that, in chapter 26 here specifically, he wasn't completely honest. But then the other element that we notice is that he wasn't the best father. And that's not to impugn his character, because again, we're looking at this with the idea of hindsight in mind. But we definitely see he played favorites. He preferred Esau over Jacob, even though it would be Jacob through whom God would proceed with his promises. Now, Isaac didn't necessarily know all those details, but he definitely had a preference for one over the other, despite the fact that Esau definitely was very troubled in his own right. And it does not seem like Isaac really offered to Jacob or to Esau much guidance, because Jacob, whose name literally means supplanter, so that tells you a little bit about his character, and Esau, who just really made some poor decisions in a lot of ways. He gave up his birthright, his marriages were very troubling to his parents, all kinds of different things that could be cited that show that Jacob and Esau just really do not seem to have been raised in the best situation and given the proper guidance from their father. So Isaac definitely had his flaws in that respect. But I find it interesting that if you look at Genesis chapter 27, and that whole chapter holistically, you really see that God used that to bring about his purpose. In that particular chapter, we have that Jacob and Rebekah actually deceive Isaac and lead Isaac to bless Jacob when he thought he was blessing Esau, because again, he preferred Esau over Jacob. So here he is blessing the wrong son because Jacob and Rebekah had orchestrated it that way. And then when Esau comes in and realizes this, and he understands that Isaac had given to Jacob the firstborn's blessing, the double portion as it were, that he weeps about this and he's very sad concerning this, even though he himself had basically given that up in previous chapters. So God was able to use Isaac's flaws to bring about his purpose. And that is going to be something we're going to see a little bit later with Jacob. We're going to see it later with other people. God is able to use these sinful situations and these troubling problems to bring about things that you would never in a million years expect. And yet it is through those very means that he's able to make the greatest impact. So that's what we find there with Isaac. We realize that he, again, was a flawed person. We realize that he had his own troubles. But again, the Lord's promise would go through him and to his descendants. And again, we're going to talk in just a moment here about how Jacob is going to factor into this. Let's go back to our slides. And we're a little bit ahead here, so let me go back in one slide here. There we go. And so we talk about Jacob, and he is a very flawed character as well. So here is Jacob, one of the most troubling Bible characters, and God is going to use him, again, as the one through whom this promise will be fulfilled. So we saw with Isaac that we don't have a lot of detail about his morals and his character, but he definitely had some problems. And if he had some problems, then Jacob most certainly does. And yet it was God's design, even before Jacob was born, that this privilege would be handed down to Jacob. Genesis chapter 25 and verse 23 makes it clear when Rebekah was struggling with having twins in her womb, she cried out to the Lord for help concerning this. And the Lord told her in no uncertain terms that there were twins in her womb, and that the younger would actually be greater than the older, which is a complete reversal of how it normally is. And yet that was God's design. So he's able to use Jacob rather than Esau to bring about his purposes. And God was clear when he spoke to Jacob later in his life that he would be the one through whom his promise would continue. Let's go to Genesis chapter 28 and verses 10 through 15 to see that. And I'm here in Genesis chapter 28 and verses 10 through 15. And let's go ahead and read this together. Now Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. So he came to a certain place and stayed there all night, because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of that place and put it at his head, and he lay down in that place to sleep. Then he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to heaven. And there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and the east, to the north and the south. And in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. That almost mimics what we saw with Isaac, does it not? So we already saw back in Genesis chapter 26 that God had said this to Isaac in the same basic way, with some details that are different here given to Jacob. But still, the fact remains that this is something given to Jacob that shows the continuation of that promise that God made to Abraham all the years before at this stage. So it goes from Abraham, it goes to Isaac, and now it comes to Jacob. And once again, what are the two main elements of this promise? Look at verse 13. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. So it involves land. It involves a territory, an inheritance that God will give to the descendants of Jacob. About the descendants in verse 14, your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. And there's a little more detail given. You shall spread abroad to the west and the east, to the north and the south. That's a lot of people. But that was God's promise to Jacob. So his descendants will be multiplied. They will be given a land by God himself to this end. And God says in verse 15, affirming that he will bring this to pass, I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. That certainly would have been a comfort to Jacob, even if he may not have fully understood what this entailed. But just notice again the continuation of this promise, the consistency by which God operates. He is giving to each descendant, each one that succeeds in the line, this promise. He's making it clear he has not forgotten what that promise is, that he has every intention to perform his oaths, that he will not turn back on them. There's another interesting detail about Jacob that we want to consider here from Genesis, and that's going to be found actually in Genesis chapter 35. And this is going to be where Jacob's name is going to change. Remember we talked about Abraham and how the first part of his name actually was Abram back in Genesis chapter 12 through about chapter 17. And then his name changes to Abraham, which means the father of the nations. So here in Genesis chapter 35, a similar event unfolds with his descendant Jacob. Let's just go ahead and read this very quickly here in Genesis chapter 35. I'm reading specifically verses 9 through 12 in Genesis chapter 35. Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram, and blessed him. And God said to him, Your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob any more, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. And God also said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac I give to you, and to your descendants after you I give this land. So once again, God makes this promise. He reaffirms this. There's also the element where he changes Jacob's name, and this is always significant when you run across this in the Old Testament, because this is really God bestowing a special privilege upon these people and indicating through this name change that he has a plan for them that is going beyond the scope of what their original name entailed. Because we have to understand, in the ancient world, the names meant a whole lot more than they do now. The name that someone had often reflected their status. It reflected perhaps their wealth or their status in the family or whatever the case might have been. So it makes a lot of sense why God would change the name of Abram or Jacob to reflect something closer to what God's plan was for them. Israel specifically means one that contends with God, and that refers specifically to how God wrestled with Jacob in the form of an angel and how Jacob prevailed over him. So that's where that name change comes in. But it's significant that the name Israel is what will be applied to the nation later on when they leave the land of Egypt. We're going to find that in the book of Exodus specifically. But all throughout the Old Testament, that nation, that land, the descendants of Abraham are going to be referred to as the people of Israel. So it's interesting here we have this name change issued, but again, it goes to show that God was the ruler of them. He was the one that was blessing them the whole time. It was always his design to bring this to pass. So even in the name Israel, you're seeing God's promise in vivid detail, and you're seeing his intention to bring this to pass. Now, we could talk a whole lot about Jacob's descendants in many terms and many ways, because he had a whole lot of children. He had 12 sons in total. We could talk all day about those. But we're going to focus specifically on Joseph. Let me go back to our slideshow here. And as we talk about Joseph, he is actually kind of a rare bright light amid some of the tragedies that unfold in the book of Genesis concerning these different families. So Joseph really does stand out in a lot of respects that are pretty positive. We find that his story starts off when he's a teenager. This is going to be Genesis chapters 37 through about 38. But in Genesis chapter 37, we find there that he was blessed above his brothers. That elicited a lot of jealousy on their part. They didn't really care too much for Joseph, and yet he was the one that Jacob preferred over the others. That's going to lead his brothers to look at him with that jealousy and also to commit a great injustice upon him. Specifically, they're going to betray him. They're going to enslave him and send him away. Now, they're going to deceive their father concerning this because they hardly would want him to know about what was done to Joseph, the preferred son. And yet it's that act that is going to lead to another great reversal in this book. And it's going to be Joseph's character and attitude that stands out amid this injustice, and how, in some respects, as we go to the New Testament, not to skip too far ahead, that he's actually going to be a type of Christ in some respects. So with all that being said, we want to look at some specific details here about Joseph very briefly to understand the type of man that he was, but more than that, how God was able to bless him abundantly despite some of the issues that he faced in his life. So again, Joseph was sold by his own brothers into slavery. He was taken by, incidentally, some Ishmaelite traders down into the land of Egypt. And there he was sold into the hand of a man by the name of Potiphar, who is a high-ranking official in Egypt. And so Joseph as a slave was not rebellious. He didn't fight back. He doesn't even seem to have a sour attitude, interestingly enough. He simply goes along with this and actually is blessed as a result of it. Let's go ahead and take a look at some more passages here in Genesis. I'm looking specifically here in chapter 39, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 5. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was, from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Notice how much God is blessing Joseph here. So Joseph is in a horrible situation. Let's make no bones about that. This is not good. This should never have happened. This was not a good situation in any sense of the word. And yet notice what God is able to do amid this unfolding tragedy. So Joseph happens to be sold into the hand of Potiphar, who happens to notice just how much the Lord is with Joseph, how much success Joseph has. He takes note of that. He gives Joseph all these privileges. He favors him greatly. He sees how good Joseph is, and God is able to bless him all throughout this situation. And even after something happens between Potiphar's wife and Joseph, which was instigated by Potiphar's wife upon Joseph, where she wanted to commit adultery with him, and Joseph refused, even amid that, the Lord was able to make Joseph prosper despite a false accusation and a false imprisonment. Let's go down just briefly to verses 21 through 23 of that same chapter in chapter 39 of Genesis. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So he was enslaved, and the Lord blessed him. He was falsely accused and in prison, and the Lord is with him. He blesses him abundantly. And there's a duality going on here, we might say, between Joseph and the Lord, where Joseph is faithful to God despite the struggles he's facing, and God is proving faithful to Joseph through all these difficulties that Joseph was enduring. So we have both of those elements that are at play here, but it's the Lord's graciousness that really shines here, his mercifulness that is really highlighted in these passages, to where God is able to look at Joseph and see a man through whom he wants to bless an entire nation down the road. And he wants to use Joseph to accomplish his purpose. He has a purpose in mind. Now, Joseph, in the moment, does not know what that purpose is. He does not fully understand what's unfolding. He just knows that he must be faithful and do what is right before God. And that is his emphasis. We see that how he responds to Potiphar's wife. He says to her plainly, "How could I do this great evil and sin against God?" That's the type of man that Joseph was. A man that was concerned with the Lord and what the Lord wanted from him, not just indulging his sinful pleasures or anything of that nature. He wanted to be faithful because the Lord was faithful to him. Moving forward in Joseph's life, we'll go back to our slideshow here. We find that because of Joseph's position now, so again, he has been enslaved, now he's in prison. It's going to be a little bit later that he's released from prison because he's able to interpret the Pharaoh's dream, and he's able to give the Pharaoh a comprehensive plan of what must be done to preserve the nation of Egypt from famine, which was soon to come. There would be 7 years of plenty that would give them the opportunity to store up for the time that was to come when the famine struck the world. And because of Joseph's counsel in that respect, which again the Lord had graciously given to him, they were able to save up for that time of famine, and they were then able to be a blessing to all the nations around them. And they were able to survive and endure all of the troubles that came upon them during that period. And notice this. It was that famine that drove Jacob and his family into Egypt. It was that famine that drove them to find Joseph, even though they didn't realize at first that it was him. And it was that famine that then led to Joseph's family, Jacob and all those who were with him, to come into the land of Egypt, for them to be blessed in that land, for 70 persons to enter into the land of Egypt, and that 70 including Joseph and his family, of course, but 70 people being preserved in the land of Egypt from famine, to set the stage for what is to come. And that is what the Lord's plan had been. And so it goes back to Genesis 15 in many respects, because in Genesis 15, if you recall, we talked there about how God told Abraham that your descendants are going to serve a nation that is fierce and dreadful, and that they are going to be brought out of that nation down the road. We're seeing the stage set for that now. There's no way in the world that Abraham would have thought that this would be Egypt. There's no way he could have seen that coming. And even the people who were in Egypt, Joseph and his family, I doubt very seriously they thought anything about that either. But again, that goes to show the Lord's plan and how he's going to bring this to pass in their lives and in the lives of their descendants for that matter, and to continue to remember that promise and that covenant. And that'll be an important consideration that we look at a little bit later. I want to look at one final passage, and that's going to bring us to Genesis chapter 50. So in Genesis chapter 50, we're going to look at one final entry here concerning Joseph, which I believe is a perfect summary of his character and really of this entire discussion that we've had. So here in Genesis 50, I'm looking specifically at verses 15 through 21. At this point, Jacob has already passed away, and the brothers of Joseph are concerned. Let's just see what their concern was and how Joseph responds to them. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "Perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him." So they sent messengers to Joseph, saying, "Before your father died, he commanded, saying, 'Thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you rather. Now please forgive the trespasses of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we are your servants. Joseph said to them, Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. That passage stands out to me every time I read it. You see in Joseph a man who was not embittered about his circumstances, but he understood correctly that the Lord was using him to bring this outcome about, that he understood that the evil that befell him was not intended to harm him per se, even if it did bring him some suffering, but it was actually intended to bring about good, and Joseph understood that, and he was accepting of that, and he understood that he was not in a position to have retribution against his brothers because that didn't matter now. It mattered that God was able to use all of these circumstances to bring about the outcome where they were preserved alive, and it's setting the stage for what will come later. But it was Joseph in many respects that set this up. Again, with God's help, of course, God being the one planning this out and orchestrating this, but Joseph being the one to cooperate with the divine will. It is wonderful to read a passage like this. We see the tenderness that Joseph expresses toward his brothers, yes, and how the family comes back together in many respects. But even more than that, we're seeing how God's promise will continue on, and how Joseph correctly interpreted the signs that God was using him and his brothers and his whole family to bring this outcome to pass. So when we talk about the patriarchs, we have a lot of dark spots there. We saw with Isaac and Jacob a few of those, and that's just a handful of the many that we could have talked about. And then we see the bright spot in Joseph, and his bright spot specifically being his attitude and the fact the Lord blessed him because he really was a cooperative person in that divine arrangement. It is so wonderful to read these stories and to review them and understand how they all fit into a unified narrative that shows to us that God had a plan and a purpose for all of them, a plan and a promise he constantly reaffirmed, and a plan and a promise that will soon unfold in the land of Egypt in the generations to come. So as we move in our discussion to talk about Moses, we're going to continue talking about these promises and how they factor into that, and how God never forgot his covenant. He never forgot his promise, but always remembered what needed to be done. I thank you for your attention to this lesson. I hope it's been beneficial to you, that it's opened your eyes perhaps to some of the things that happened with the patriarchs. I know we didn't go into great detail with every situation that unfolded there, but time forbids us to spend too much on that. We'll pick up next week talking about Moses, and we're going to have some extended conversations about Moses through the month of February. We're going to understand his different roles and his different purposes and how that all fits together once again to show the work of God in his plan and his promises. Thank you.